Is the first. Oh, I always forget to wait for that bit. Welcome, everyone. This is the first of our Getting Published sessions at DSA 2022. And in this session, we'll be dealing with journal publications, and tomorrow's session will deal with books. And in each session, we've got three editors of outlets with strong connections to the DSA and development studies much more generally as well. Nothing quite as exciting as getting published in journals. I remember, I'm not sure, I'm guessing most of you are ECRs, that my first publishing experience was via a DSA conference. It would have been 2001 in one of the journals represented here, Journal of International Development. So you're in the right place to start your publishing career if that's what you're doing. And even if you're already a fair way down that line, this is, you can never stop learning. We never stop getting rejections as academics, including the editors amongst us. And so it's a good place to get tips as to how to course correct as the world keeps changing with new editorial teams, new orientations amongst the publishing outlets. So how we're going to run this is our three editors are each going to spend a few minutes sharing some advice and maybe a few particular insights into their individual journals. And then the floor is very much open for your questions, which I'll field. Please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try and bring them together if there's some good links. Otherwise, feel free to put your hand up. Great if we can see you. It's always nicer for people to be talking to the closest approximation of a real person we can manage online. So if your bandwidth allows, please do join us visually as well as audio wise. So just to introduce our panel, the first speaker will be Cheryl Doss, who is a Professor of International Development at University of Oxford and representing Oxford Development Studies. Then we'll have Oliver Morrissey, Professor of Economics at University of Nottingham, representing the Journal of Development Studies. And then Professor Ashild Kolas, who works at PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, representing the Journal of International Development. So great panel, all being strong supporters of the DSA. So many thanks for coming along today to share your insights. And over to you, Cheryl.
Great, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here and be part of this panel. So I'm going to make 3 points today. The first one is to think carefully about which journal you're going to submit to. So really choose the journal that's right for the particular paper that you're writing. For many of you who are at DSA, you could write papers that fit very well into a development studies journal, or you could write ones that fit into a disciplinary journal or often a regional journal. And so going to the journal, looking at the journal, trying to see what it is that they publish, what's the format, what's the style, can be really important. I can't tell you how many papers we get at ODS that just simply are not a good fit. We get sent really technical economics papers that we're not interested in. And it's a waste of your time to do that. So look carefully, talk to people, and read the journals, see what might be a good fit for that particular paper. And for many papers, you could frame them either way. You could frame them for one kind or frame them for another. So thinking about which journal you want to be sending them to, or which sets of journals as you're writing it can be really helpful. My second comment is related to the first, but that what you want to be doing in some sense is joining a conversation on a particular topic. People often like to talk about that there's a gap in the literature and they're filling a gap. And I get cover letters that say, no one has ever written on this topic before. I'm the first person to ever do this. Often that's because what they're doing actually isn't very interesting, right? Nobody's ever run a regression of X on Y in this country before, but it's not at all clear why we would be interested in that. I think it's more useful to think about it as that there's a conversation going on about a particular topic, and you have something to add to that conversation. So that that ties into knowing what that journal is. There should have been other papers probably published in that journal that are at least related to the topic that you're writing about. So that's my second piece, to think about how you're joining the conversation. And my third point is that the editor, so when you send it to the journal, in our case, it comes directly, I look at them first, and then send them off to associate editors, or else I'll desk reject them. But I should not be the first person who's ever reading your paper besides you. Before you submit a paper to a journal, you should have had lots of people read it. You should have had your mentors read it, your supervisor, several of your classmates or other early career researchers. I would never send a paper to a journal without having had other people reading it first. You will get good comments, you will get some bad comments and useless comments, but you want to have gotten a lot of that feedback and to understand where people might be confused, what they might not understand, so that you can rewrite it before you first submit it. And that will greatly increase your chances of getting it published. So I will stop there.
That's great. Many thanks, Cheryl. Very sound and clear. 3 points there. Oliver, over to you.
Okay, just making sure I was unmuted to avoid the most common mistake on Zoom. Most of my comments will be kind of elaborating or reiterating on things that Cheryl has already said. And I think the first thing is, you do need to pay attention to the journal you submit to. You want to submit to a good journal, we're assuming that, and there are many, and they all have different types of interests. So I'm one of 6 editors of the Journal of Development Studies, and 4 of the editors are economics, and 2 of the editors are political science. And that more or less reflects the balance of publications in the journal. Roughly speaking, 2/3 are economics, and the rest are non-economics. They're not all political science, and some of the political science are quantitative political science, but that's the balance as it is at the moment. Another point of context to put in is that JDS gets about 1,500 submissions a year. Now, we publish fewer than 150 papers a year. So less than 10% of submissions are ultimately published. And we can't send a vast number out to referees, so almost 80% will be desk rejected. And that's common. A large proportion of desk rejections is common across many journals. In most cases, it's because the editor sees the paper and says, look, that just doesn't really fit this journal. And then there'll be others where they might think, well, yeah, okay, the topic kind of fits. There's something maybe interesting here, but it's underdeveloped. The sample is small. I'm speaking more for economics or quantitative papers. So, you've got to try and tailor the journal or your paper submission to a journal that publishes similar types of papers. But it's also important that your paper is adding something more. It's not just doing something that has already been published in that journal, but doing it in a different country or a different context. There has to be a bit more than that. You have to justify, well, why is this different context of particular interest? What new insights are there? So, you do have to tailor the submission to a journal that seems to be interested in the area, but you have to also be contributing, adding to what's known, so that the editors will kind of look at it and say, oh yeah, there's a new point here, there's something innovative here. Maybe I'll get it reviewed. And that's the first hurdle and difficult hurdle you have to jump over. Now, you should be taking the view that you're submitting your best paper to this journal, or that the paper is as good as you can make it. So you should be very happy with the paper at the time you submit it. But be prepared for the fact that the reviewers probably won't take the same view. We've all experienced that. We thought, this is a really good paper. I'm really happy with the way it's gone. And then a reviewer picks holes in it. Hopefully, you get a good reviewer who's conscientious, and they're legitimate holes. They raise legitimate issues. If you're lucky, you might get a revise and resubmit. If you're less lucky, or if the paper does have significant weaknesses, you might get a reject. So, and that relates to the point Cheryl made, is you do need to get people to comment on that paper before you submit it. Ideally, it needs to be more than supervisors or colleagues if you gave an internal seminar. Ideally, you want to present at a conference or present somewhere else where other people can comment on it. Now, over the last few years, that's sometimes difficult. But it's always difficult to get at conferences. In fact, in certain respects, online conferences have made it easier for people to get an opportunity to present, but often the feedback or the comments you get can be more limited. So, but it is important to try and get comments of critical reviewers who are somewhat separated from your own research. So say separated from your supervisors or advisors or colleagues. And that's something that is useful to do. It helps, but it doesn't guarantee anything. Once the editor is convinced that, yes, it's a good fit for the journal, and I'll send it out to reviewers, then there's the process of who do they find to review it. It's always worth keeping in mind that the authors you cite in the references will often be the first point of call for an editor. They'll look through the references and see who do they know in that list, what names are they familiar with, and so they're quite likely to pick one of the reviewers from your reference list. So keep that in mind. Don't be overly critical of the papers you're citing because they might be the reviewers. Now, I know that Ashil is going to talk about some issues with Manuscript Central. I only want to make 2 points about the actual submission process. And the first is that there is what I find, frankly, irritating and frustrating differences across the requirements of all different journals. They may all use the same platform for submissions like Manuscript Central, but typically each journal has its own idiosyncrasies, often associated with the publishers, about how you have to structure the journal and how rigid they are about the length, about how you reference, about whether or not you can have an online appendix or supplementary materials. You need to pay attention to that. It's frustrating. Well, at least I find it frustrating, and it can be time wasting from one's perspective, but you just need to check, is there something that the journal is quite strict about? Some journals are strict on the length of the paper. So if they are, you need to make sure that you're within their word limit. Otherwise, you just get it straight back saying, oh, you're 200 words over our limit or whatever. So if they have that restriction, you need to keep that in mind. Some journals, not all, most economics journals will allow you to at least have supplementary materials or an online appendix or additional detail that is for the benefit of reviewers, but would not be published with the paper itself. If that's available on the journal website, then it's very sensible to include any additional detail you can with the submission, if the journals accept it. It's become common in economics papers where the online appendix is about twice the length of the paper itself. It's where the author goes through every possible permutation of econometric comments they think the referee might possibly make, and kind of go through them and say, look, this doesn't affect our results, this doesn't affect our results, etc., etc. Or in others, it might be providing details about a survey that was used, or whatever. But check what the journal will allow you to submit and make your submission fit what the journal requires. And I think they're kind of it. If you've got, I suppose the one other thing I would just mention, in case it's relevant to people, but and it also follows on one of the things that Cheryl said, is that the type of papers that journals publish will also differ. So I mentioned that JDS does publish, roughly speaking, 2/3, if not more, of the papers are economics, but they're nearly all microeconomics, applied microeconomics. We're not interested in purely theoretical papers. And in an economic sense, that would be formal theoretical papers. We don't publish them. Papers may have some theory to motivate the analysis, but we don't want just a theory paper. And in general, we're not very keen on kind of cross-country regressions, unless there's something very novel about the way in which they approach the problem. So most of the papers we look at are, using household level data or firm level data or farm level data to analyze a particular issue. So, keep an eye on what type of papers the journal publish. Is your paper a fit? And does your paper say something of value that adds to those papers that have already been published? And I'll finish there.
Many thanks, Oliver. So backing up and amplifying some of Cheryl's points and some new stuff there as well. Thank you. And Ashield, over to you for our final talk. And then we've got one question in the chat already. Please either add to the chat or get ready to put your hand up when Ashield is finished. All yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what the excellent points that Cheryl and Oliver already made. But I'm going to try to expand a little bit on how some useful tips. So I'm one of the 4 editors of the Journal of International Development. We started in early 2021, and we did have a record number of submissions in 2021, 813. And out of those, 90, or not just out of those, but 93 articles were published in 2021, so that's slightly above 10% acceptance rate for us as well. And yeah, I think the main thing that I would like to focus on here is the platform that all of the different journals, that at least the journals that are here are using, which is Manuscript Central. So my journal is a Wiley journal, and we have Taylor and Francis and other publishers. They all seem to use the same platform. And one of the things that I think is important for new authors to consider after they have carefully selected a journal and did everything they could to abide by the author guidelines, and maybe even looked for an editorial from new editors, or just looked at the articles that have already been published over the past couple of years. You could even look at your own reference list and see what kind of journals are there. So after that careful selection has been done, hopefully if you get a desk rejection, you will get it quickly. So I'm going to focus on what happens, or how do you get the best reviewers, because I think that it's really important, even if you're going to be rejected in the end, that you have really good reviewer comments so that you can work more and move forward to develop your work and then try again. So the Manuscript Central is connected to a database called the Web of Science Reviewer Locator. And the way that so I know that some editors or some review editors would just choose based on their own network, or they would invite reviewers based on their own network. Sometimes I do that too, but mainly I rely on the Web of Science Reviewer Locator, and it shows up 30 reviewers, potential reviewers, which is based on the keywords and words in the title and the abstract. So once those matches have been made by the reviewer locator, once they are invited, then what the potential reviewers would see is only the title and the abstract. So when they make a decision whether to review or not, it's just based on the title and the abstract. So of course, ideally you want good reviewers, and the way to get good reviewers and to get good reviewers quickly, based on my experience from the last 1.5 years at least, is that the abstract is excellent. So everything depends on how you pitch, exactly why this is interesting, what your topic is, what is the research problem, what are the findings, and why is this interesting? What are the new insights? What is this adding to the conversation? And what exactly is the conversation that you want to join? So I think that if you get those then really well articulated in the abstract and the title, and please don't make any spelling mistakes in the title. That is like, I'm so sad when I see somebody has made a spelling mistake in the title, because I'm thinking, oh, how is this going to get reviewed? So it's really important to just double check, triple check. Is this the best abstract that you have ever written? And does this really capture the attention of the reviewer? Because once you have the good reviewer, and this is also, of course, all happening behind the scenes. Then once these excellent reviewers that we have some really good, wonderful reviewers who give really good comments. And if you then get a revise and resubmit, pay very careful attention to the comments. Don't think, well, this reviewer said this, the other reviewer said that, so I don't have to do it. No, just you have to make your own decisions, but don't ignore any of the comments, even if they go in different directions, and really address it carefully. And then you can count on at least one of the reviewers re-reviewing it after it's resubmitted. So I think that is probably the best way to go if you want to get published. And I'll end with that.
Excellent, thanks, Cheryl. That's great. Okay, so the floor is open. Let's start with the question in the chat, and while the rest of you come up with your questions. Victorine, do you want to verbalize your question in case people arrive too late for it to be in their chat? Are you even still with us?
Hello, thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, the audio is not great.
Maybe I will let it.
Okay, let me just in case anybody didn't enter in time for the chat, for your chat to be there. The question is, we've been advised by at least 2 panelists to get papers reviewed before submitting them by friends and mentors, but is there a danger here that in that process the work gets, not to put too fine a point on it, stolen and submitted by someone else? So who would like to respond to that one?
Well, an immediate reaction is, I think that is, well, certainly in my experience, that is very, very rare.
Mhm.
People typically aren't going to do that. And I suppose can elaborate. First of all, the initial comments should be from advisors and colleagues. It's not generally a good idea to try and try and send it to somebody you don't know to get comments. If there's, because sometimes you might think, well, this person has written on this area, they're known as an expert, I'd like to get their comments. Well, you might, but they're probably very busy people who have a lot of commitments to their own students, their own colleagues, and they get a request out of the blue, and even if they are well-intentioned, they just may not have the time. So if you are trying to do that, if there is somebody, and if a colleague knows that person, or your advisor knows that person, then you could kind of send an email with a type of an introduction that might help. But it's, if the other option, and this is mostly only available to people, in universities in the UK or Europe or the US, but your early draft, or your first version, when you've got it ready and you're reasonably happy with it, that could be published as a working paper or a research paper, or even as a chapter in a thesis, where that means that, well, that date stamps it. That date stamps it as your work at a particular time. It becomes in the public domain, but if somebody then tries to copy that, that's plagiarism, and they're guilty of an academic offense or research ethical misconduct that journals would take a very bad view of. So likewise, of course, when you're submitting, you've got to be very careful that you are attributing sources accurately in your paper as well. It's very rare, but I've certainly come across papers submitted that looked strangely familiar in sections, and we then found out that, well, yeah, basically, either through carelessness or intent, they've basically just copied and slightly altered, or maybe got Google to alter the words, but they were taking material from somewhere else and they weren't citing it. So it's something one has to be careful of as an author, but in general, one shouldn't be afraid of somebody else stealing your ideas, as long as you're showing it to people who are known to be reliable.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think I think hopefully the part of the answer is in the question, friends and mentors. Hopefully they can be people who should be trusted. And would it be fair to the panel would agree maybe that sharing it is actually a form of self-defense as well against, I mean, I think it's really rare, but the more that the circle of your epistemic community know that you've done this work because you've shared it with them, that's a form of protection in itself, surely. So anything to add, Cheryl or Ashilda? So I think we're in agreement that full sharing and getting that input to strengthen the piece beforehand is massively outweighs the small risk of that you're concerned with there, Victorine. Okay, Cheryl, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I would just add too that one of the things that sometimes happens is when you start presenting it at conferences and things, you find that somebody else is working on something fairly similar. And that's always a moment of panic on both sides. But often you can actually have a conversation with the other people and try to figure out how to pitch the two papers so that they're a little bit different, so that you're not, and usually that's not very hard. And I know that I've gotten involved with my students when they've been concerned about that and been part of those negotiations, but everybody's better off. Both of you are better off if you can figure out how to have them overlap as little as possible, and knowing what's out there can be really helpful in that regard.
And lead to good, often postdoctoral collaborations between the two people as well.
Exactly.
I've seen that happen, so yeah. Okay, any other questions from colleagues in the room? I had a couple of follow-up queries, but I'll definitely let people prioritize, lead with their priorities.
While we're waiting, I'll just follow up on the previous comments. Is one thing that, again, it's rare, but it can happen where, as Cheryl said, that two people are working, or two groups of people, or two people are working separately on what comes out to be a fairly similar type of paper. They're looking at the same issue, and it can happen that, or it does happen some rare occasions, that one of them gets in first with a publication, and they may try to delay or make it difficult for the other paper to publish, sometimes by being chosen as referees. I've come across that on rare occasions, but it can happen. Now, some journals in the submission will allow you or ask you to nominate referees. My personal view is that in general, that's a bad idea. I don't like being asked that, and I don't like doing it. If I do, I'll just put in, usually, if I have to fill that box in, some journals, you have to fill it in, otherwise you can't move on to the next step. Then I just look at the people on the board of editors, on the editorial board, not the editors, but the editorial board for the journal, and pick a name from there that I think is suitable, so that I've ticked the box. Where it can be useful, however, is if you want to say, I would not want somebody to referee this paper. And if you have a particular concern, you could put that in a cover letter and explain why, that you don't really would not like a certain author or group of authors to review your paper for the following reasons. And that's a legitimate thing to do, and that can protect you from these very rare occasions where you happen to be working on the same area as a competitive other group who don't follow the publication ethics that most of us feel people should follow. Another small but related comment, it's not always small, is there should also be due care and attention to who's listed as authors or who's acknowledged as having contributed. That, the authors listed should all agree, and it should all be appropriate. And somebody who made a significant contribution should be listed as an author unless they themselves don't want to be for whatever reason. So, and that's kind of a related issue to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. Martina, go ahead.
Hi, Oliver. That was a point that I wasn't expecting about the fact that you don't think it's a good idea to nominate reviewers, because it's a very painful thing for me having to think about the reviewers to nominate, and I invest so much time in finding the right people, those that I think are the right people. So it's great that you're telling this. Can you elaborate a bit more why you don't think it's a good idea, please?
Well, as an economist, I would use game theory to explain why it's not a good idea. Because, well, first of all, I think that's the editor's job. You know, the editors have one major task, which is to find reviewers for papers that they think are worth reviewing, and then to form a view on the basis of those reviews. So I think editors should do that. Asking an author to do that, well, you don't know why they are nominating somebody. If you think they're nominating somebody because they know them personally and feel I'll get a good review from them, then, or they may even already know the paper and you think, yeah, I'll get a good review from them because I presented it at a conference and they came up to me and said, yeah, that's a really interesting paper, I like that. Then, you know, the editor shouldn't be guided by that. They shouldn't be trying to choose or allowing themselves choose a referee who's predisposed to give a particular view on the paper. And if you ask them to nominate the reviewer, then a rational person would strategically nominate somebody they think will give them a favorable review. And on that basis, the editors should not choose the person you nominate.
Can I add to that? The reviewers should actually be critical. They should give constructive criticism. They shouldn't be giving you a pat on the back and saying accept, because that's not going to let you develop your paper. So, and usually they don't do that. So, so yeah, it's good to get some proper feedback, and yeah, I mean, our journal doesn't ask the contributors to choose reviewers, so we decided not to do that because of the reasons that Oliver mentioned.
That's great, thank you.
Cheryl, do you have something to add there?
I was just gonna kind of add on to a little bit of what Oliver said, which is that as an editor, I've a few times gotten letters from authors who wrote to me and said, you know, I got this review that was really negative and I know who it was and they're out to get me and they hate me and they're picking on me and they've always been out to get me, and never have they been right about who the person was. And so, and I've actually had that as an author, where the editor came back to me and I saw some of the correspondence, and it was clear that the as a reviewer, that it was clear that the author was sure that I was somebody else and had a vested interest, and I wanted to publish something first. And I had to write to the editor and say, you know, I'm working in that country, but I'm not at all interested in using that kind of data. So just to say that even if you're absolutely sure that you know who gave you that harsh review, you're very likely to be wrong. You don't actually know who they are.
Thanks. It's reassuring. I've definitely had that in mind once or twice, I must admit. In terms of, I've never bothered writing though to an editor to complain about it. Can I just pick up on one comment? I don't know if Ashield and Cheryl, you agree with Oliver's point that it's wise not to be too critical of the people you're citing in your paper, because they may end up being the reviewers. And I just worry about overthinking the review process in ways that may skew at worst, I don't think you were suggesting this, Oliver, but at worst, skew the intellectual integrity of what you're trying to do. You may have strongly held opinions and good reasons to oppose 2 or 3 of the big names in your field, and you shouldn't not do that because you think they might review your work. Is it a question of tone rather than a question of the strength of critique that we're thinking about here?
Yeah, I meant tone and type of criticism. I don't mean critically in the academic sense of critical analysis and a critical view and saying, you know, and arguing your case as to why you're making a different view. What I am saying is don't be disrespectful. And I know of some authors who are and have been, and you know, that's inappropriate, and actually it reduces the quality of your paper. So it's more, you know, you don't have to agree with people, and a good referee doesn't expect that the paper has to agree with their own view. And a good editor should know when a referee is not behaving in that way. But not all editors and not all reviewers are as experienced or as even-handed as we might like them to be, and you need to keep that in mind.
Mhm.
So, be critical if you can fully substantiate your criticism and be respectful in the way that you make it.
Mhm. Thanks.
That's how I understood Oliver already, but thanks for clarifying that. But I also want to say that we've been talking a lot about the reviewers, but the editors are, the editors get, well, at least we get 2 different reviews. And we do, if there's the discrepancy, if one says reject and the other says accept, we get a 3rd. So usually, and we do know how to, we do see these things, how certain reviewers are not so good. And yeah, we usually, I hope most editors would see through that.
I was intrigued, Ashield, and reassured that you said that because you often get conflicting reviews, and as a resubmittee, you often wonder, which way to go. And sometimes the editorial advice is either very hands-off, and it's just up to you to make up your mind which reviewers to respond to, and sometimes much clearer. It varies, I think. But one thing you said was reassuring, but I wonder if it's across all journals, is that the re-review would be done by somebody who is involved in the first round of reviews. Because I know for some journals that wouldn't be always the case. I've sometimes come in as a reviewer after the paper's been reviewed a couple of times, either because the initial referees couldn't agree or wouldn't re-review or whatever it is. Is this any more advice from yourselves as editors as to how to deal with those conflicting reviews and what approach your journals take to conflicting reviews?
Well, since I was the one who brought that up, I'll try to quickly respond to that first. So I think that, as I already said, it's your paper. So if you feel that one of the reviewers is really off track, and you just explain that and say, I haven't addressed that because I feel that that's going to weaken the paper, or just give a good reason, and the editor will see that. But what you shouldn't do is to use both of them as an excuse to do nothing. Mm-hmm. Let's see. So if one review, I did have one paper where one reviewer said you should cut down on the introduction, and the other one said you should reduce something else, and then they didn't do anything, and it ended up being rejected.
Okay, so. Thanks for that. Anything else, Cheryl? Anything on the?
I mean, we always send them back to the original reviewers, but sometimes they're not available. I try to not, if we send it to somebody completely different, which occasionally we do, I would just say that you're more likely to get different reviewers the longer you take to resubmit, right? So that if it takes you a year to resubmit, it's going to be harder to get those original reviewers to review again. So turning it back around, making a priority be you've got to revise and resubmit to get that back in quickly. I try not to let a new reviewer come in and just say something, have them do something completely different and go in a completely different direction. I feel like as an editor, it's my job to use my judgment and to take the 2 sets of reviewers' comments and provide some advice on what the authors need to do. Sometimes won't send it back to one because I really disagreed with what the reviewer said, and I don't think they're going to like the changes, and I'm not interested in having them go in that direction. But I agree that you need to really respond to what the reviewers have said and explain why you've made the changes you're making. I also wanted just to say one thing, kind of on the issue about citing people and citing other people's work. I think that often people feel like their papers are better if they cite lots and lots of papers in their articles. And one of the things, both as an editor and as a reviewer, that really puts me off is when somebody cites, well, the one that really sets me off is when somebody cites my work wrong. Right. And I know what I said. sometimes I've gone back and said, is there any way they could have read what I wrote and actually came up with that? But often people are just citing something that was already cited, and it's, you know, it's kind of like that game of telephone. It's also the case if they cite somebody's work that I know really well and they're citing it wrong. And this happens quite a bit. And if you've cited the things I know wrong, then I have no faith that you've cited the other things correctly, right? And so it's hard to just reject a paper because there's lots of wrong citations, but it really makes me question the quality of the work. So don't just throw in citations to have more and pad it out and have names that you think are good names to have in your paper. Make sure that you've actually done that correctly and that they're referring to the right, that you're referring to the right paper of theirs.
So Oscar Wilde was wrong. There is something worse than being ignored. It's it's being misrepresented.
I'll just add agreement. Yeah, make sure your citations are correct. But the other thing, in terms of citing a lot of papers, many editors of journals, they don't like gratuitous citations. Now, gratuitous citations are particularly popular in North America and North American journals, at least in economics. And by that, I mean that certain big names, you feel, well, I have to cite these people, because if I don't cite these people, they won't even consider my paper, which is probably true for what are called the top 5 economics journals, but that's not generally the case in development studies. And the point is, you know, have appropriate citations, but don't bother with gratuitous citations, as citing somebody that isn't really relevant, or the paper you're citing isn't really relevant, just because you think, well, I better get that name in there. It's also, you know, it also doesn't help to pad out citations with a lot of minor contributions, you know, that really aren't adding an awful lot to what you're doing either. So, you know, get the citations right. To go back to the original, the other issue, I think the standard policy in JDS is that the paper will go back to at least one of the original reviewers. Sometimes, as I think the others have said, we may not send it back to one of the reviewers because we've decided, okay, we're going in a particular direction and it's not the direction that their review wanted the paper to go in. That does happen sometimes, but in general, it'll go back to both reviewers or sometimes just one. In exceptional cases, if after the review process, there's still a disagreement and the editor who's handling it doesn't feel they alone should make the decision, then we would ask either one of the other editors or one of the members of the editorial board to look at the paper with full information. They would get the reviews, the responses, and the paper, and we just say, look, this is what I think. What do you think? And I think responsible journals will tend to do it that way.
Sounds reasonable. Any more queries from the floor? I have one, but I prefer the questions came from colleagues. Elsewhere in the room? If there are, I can't see any hands. One strategy that, well, I've certainly used a lot, and I've always encouraged junior colleagues to use a lot, is to get work published in working papers. And I think, Oliver, you flagged that as a route to date stamping your work and making sure it's out there in advance of the very lengthy, often very lengthy process for journal submission. But the problem here is that several journals have now started saying we will not take work that has already been published in working paper form, which I find really concerning and very undemocratic in terms of sharing of knowledge, given the paywalls that shape the access issues around many of the journals in our field, particularly in terms of Global South colleagues having quick access, and possibly much worse in economics where the lead times are even longer. Can I ask if any of your journals, and I literally don't know this, any of your journals? What's your policy on work that has been previously published as a working paper and then reworked, probably shortened quite significantly, revised after reviews, and then submitted to your journal? Is it something you have an active policy on in any of your journals? And I'll just go around the screen. So Ashild first.
Yeah, we've discussed that quite a bit. I'm not so used to it from anthropology. In my opinion, in the beginning was, oh no, this has already been published. But then the economists were saying, no, this is how we do it it's not a problem. But it will show up in the something that I should have mentioned, authenticate, which is the plagiarism check, will give a high similarity score. And then the review editor has to go and check. And in that case, what I do find sometimes is that the working paper is not, or the bits and pieces of, let's say, another published paper by the same authors that should give a really high similarity score, they're not, if the working paper might be, or the published article might be cited, but not where it should. So that's kind of annoying, because you should really pay attention to actually citing your own work. It's not a problem for the double blind, because it's worse if you don't do it. So if you don't cite your own work, it's really, pay more attention to maybe changing the wording and not taking big chunks of text from a working paper or something. But I'm not sure about the working paper, and it's really difficult for those review editors who are not familiar with all the different places where you can upload working papers. So it is a difficult question, and I don't really have a simple answer.
Thanks. Cheryl?
Yeah, we're fine if you want to publish it as a working paper first. Generally, I would think that by the time it then goes through our review process, usually you shorten it to start with, it goes through the review process and it's going to look somewhat different. We also use a plagiarism software checker, and it will flag it up. So what we would ask you to do is just to acknowledge, right? You can do it in the acknowledgements to say that this comes out of or an earlier draft was published as a working paper, or right, lots of conference papers now get published online. And so if you say, it was published there, then that's fine, particularly if it's by the same authors. But we would, again, encourage you to do that rather than discourage you from doing it.
Okay, and anything from JDS, Oliver?
Yeah, it's the same. We're perfectly happy for people to submit papers that have already appeared as a working paper, research paper, conference paper, safe in the knowledge that if it does eventually get published, it will be substantially different. Mm-hmm. At the very minimum, it will be shorter and more concise, and you may then refer to the working paper for more detail. But often results will change, new analysis will be included. So we don't have any problem with that. And that's partly because I suppose we're much closer to a well-established tradition in economics where everybody publishes, the first version does appear as some type of working paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to maintain that route for early careers researchers in whatever discipline. That PhD chapter is going to take a lot of work to get it out there. And if you're going to have an interim step, a departmental working paper series, or a relevant research centre series, it just helps get through. It forces you to get your work re-reviewed before going out to the bigger world of journals. Okay, I can't see any hands. You are welcome to throw in one more question, but it seems that
there's a question in the chat. How can we have collaboration with the researchers in other areas, from Yvette?
I wondered if that would have responded to Yvette on that. I wondered if it is a bit too broad for us here, but if you can think of something, a way of linking it, then you're welcome.
Okay. I guess attending online conferences is good. Yeah, and being active in the chat.
Yeah, I think that's right. Spotting people who are working on similar issues via conferences, and for people in different contexts, often online conferences, webinars are really good places to do that, and letting people know you've got a working interest in that area. People are always interested to share ideas, I think, on similar topics and shared interests. Okay, and the biggest one till last, there we go. What will be criteria for an excellent paper for journal publication? This will be, because we only have 4 minutes, our last question, I think. Who wants to go first on this?
Well, an excellent paper, well written, good analysis, whether empirical or qualitative, doesn't matter, but it has to be good analysis up to current standards in that journal, that adds a new insight, that has something new to say, that adds to what previous people have said. Now, most journals, not every paper that gets published meets all of those criteria, but it is reasonably well written. The analysis has to be very competent and correct. And there has to be something justified that there is a new insight or some innovation in it.
An important contribution to the ongoing conversations that Charles kicked us off with. Any other criteria to add?
Ideally based on new research, new research, fresh analysis, and exciting findings. Yep, that add to the most interesting debate.
Okay. Cheryl, looks like you're okay with those. As if for developments of these journals, does it have to have that sort of final section on policy implications, or do some papers maybe really not quite big enough, quite substantive enough to justify a whole new policy regime?
I would say don't add policy recommendations that don't come out of your research. I feel like often people feel like they need to write policy recommendations, and so they make up policy recommendations based on what they think, but that aren't really based on what their research is. Certainly for us, you wouldn't have to have policy recommendations. You want some kind of conclusions, but it doesn't have to be policy recommendations.
Yeah, you want implications, but they should only relate to policy if your analysis relates to the specific policy that you're going to make a recommendation on. But as Cheryl said, you know, the worst thing to see is, and I've often seen it, is a list of policy recommendations that could have been written before the paper was ever written, and probably were, and were taken off some government document or something like that. You know, it's not a consultancy report, it's an academic paper.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Great. Right, we're up against time. Thanks ever so much, all of you, Ashild, Oliver, Cheryl, and to everyone who's come and asked really important questions. And I think we all wish you all the very best in your next steps in terms of getting published in journals. And if you're interested in getting published in books, then it's, I think, the same time tomorrow. You can join up with some journal editors with great book series in this field. So do watch out for that one as well. Many thanks all. See you.
Okay, good luck, Sam. Good luck all. See you next year.
Right.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.